Hello, Endersword here again, this time with an update on the PvP meta ahead of the June incursion. There's obviously been a lot of changes this month with mirror data and mirror per card being introduced and the whole concept of the apex barrier coming into PvP. The main effect of that is going to be that we're going to get a lot longer fights again, potentially. Fights had hit a point where at the high end you were getting really 1 or 2 rounds at most of combat because so much was being pumped out in pure damage and isolytic damage that everything was just dying very, very quickly. The apex barrier and increased isolytic defense are going to help extend that, so we're going to get longer and longer fights again going forward, depending on the crews that people are using. So we're going to take a look at some of that and how these officers from the strike team and isolytic teams play together with the mirror guys and how you can kind of shift your crews depending on what you're playing against. For this month in particular, it's going to very much not be a one-size-fits-all sort of situation. There's going to be a lot more kind of rock, paper, scissors and playing around the specific ship and officer type combos that your opponents are using. So we're going to get into some of that. But the first thing I wanted to look at is just an excerpt from a battle log. This is me against a higher level player that donated their cube to be hit a few times for some logs and research for me. But I just wanted to basically break down, for those that don't know, how the apex barrier is working and kind of where isolytic damage also sits at the moment. So in this case, I was out-leveled by a fair bit. This person's 5 ops levels higher than me. So my standard mitigation is going to be the mitigation number divided by the standard damage I do. In this case was 65%. That's pretty high. If you're fighting someone around your own level, you're very likely to be in the 50% range or lower, but punching up, you're going to get this a lot, even with the battle triangle in my favor. This is still pretty high. But the biggest change that we've seen over the last few months is the increase in this mitigation percentage. The isolytic damage here is again going to be the same thing. 52 million divided by the 64 million is going to give us 81.1% isolytic damage. And this is pretty typical now. They've added so many isolytic defense artifacts, including the new cephalocask artifact that you can get by turning in those Gorn chests. Basically, that is going to raise your isolytic defense a lot. And when someone's isolytic defense starts to get above about 300%, it's going to very consistently be higher mitigation than their standard is. If you recall, standard damage mitigation caps at 71.2%, whereas isolytic defense can continue to go up. So when you are at a point, this person would have an isolytic defense total of about 400 and something. So it's 100 plus whatever your isolytic defense number is. So it's cutting down to less than 20% of the damage is actually getting through that mitigation at the end. Then we come to the new apex mitigation. This one, to calculate what the percentage is, you basically take this number, the apex barrier mitigation, and then divide it by the last 3 numbers. So divide it by itself plus the shield health damage and the hull damage. It will basically tell you how much damage the apex barrier has saved the person for. So in this case, 59.1%. So this person was running Mirror Picard as the captain, and they obviously have additional research as well, and it was a tier 2 Picard. So the tier 2 Picard gives you 13,000 of the apex barrier, and then likely had some of the other mirror research done as well. So 10,000 is going to give you a flat 50%. If it was 20,000, it would be 66%. 30,000 would give you 75%. It kind of scales down, but the equation is basically 10,000 divided by 10,000 plus whatever the number is. So if they had 30,000, it's 10,000 divided by 40,000, so 1/4, and you take the inverse of that, so 75%. A quarter gets through, you're mitigating 75%. So this is around the ballpark of what you're mostly going to see this month, unless someone I don't even know if it was possible to get a tier 3 or higher Picard at this point, since there's only been 2 of them. So even if you got the full unlock, SMS complete, I'm not sure whether that was enough for tier 3, but definitely you're not going to see like the maxed out 30,000 that he's capable of just yet. However, the mirrored data is capable of giving additional against interceptors. So you could see 15,000 from him plus the 10 or something thousand from Picard at the same time. So it is possible to see like a 60 or 70% mitigation. Then the shield mitigation is going to be that 80% pretty much most of the time, unless there is an officer at play or one of you has research that the other does not. But there's 2 researchers that are plus 2.5% mitigation and negative 2.5% mitigation for your opponent. But most people have both of them. So it tends to cancel out to the 80%. And then the hull damage number is, of course, the actual damage that your ship is taking to the hull. And that's the one that counts. So you have to go through these 4 layers first before you get to the hull damage. I think most people kind of knew that, but haven't fully integrated what the apex barrier is yet, just by not having seen it too much. On the damage side, which is going to be an important part of this, it's important to know what components are going to increase the actual damage output you do. We're now facing this new barrier that's going to basically cut the damage completely in half or greater, as long as the Mirror Picard is active. So basically, even at tier 1, just Mirror Picard, no other research or anything else, it's going to completely cut the damage in half. So it's important to know what is increasing your damage output in the first place. So basically, you've got standard damage that you do. That's based on your ship's weapons. That's based on research that you have. That's based on basic things like that. That's the first number. Isolytic damage is then going to be a multiplier on top of that. So you take your standard damage, that is going to be multiplied by the isolytic damage times the cascade isolytic. So the isolytic damage is flat, but the cascade takes the total of those and multiplies it yet again. So it gives you a ramped up version of it. So cascade and isolytic are both kind of, it's one of the few things in the games that is actually kind of multiplicative, that it cascades literally on itself. So that's going to be giving you the isolytic number that you see here in total. This is about 240 something percent of what my standard damage is. However, if we recall from before, this amount against somebody my own level or somebody like fairly high is going to be likely mitigated a lot more than my standard damage is. So even though this number is a lot higher, when it comes to what actually gets through the door, it may end up being lower depending on what your differentials are. If somebody was mitigating only 50% of my standard, but they were mitigating 85% of my isolytic, then my standard damage is actually probably going to get through more than the isolytic is. So it depends on your opponent there and how much isolytic defense they have. But over time, that's been going up and up and up to the point that eventually everyone, even kind of a mid-40s, low 50s player, is going to have like 80-90% of the isolytic damage mitigated by that. Next up is the critical chance. I think everyone kind of knows what this is, which is just your chance of landing a crit. There's research that brings this up or down. Officers can obviously bring this up or down. Honor Guard Worf, Garrick, things like that. Pawn and Phlox on the negative side. So when the 2 ships come together, you're basically taking your critical chance, subtracting their negative critical chance from it. And for a lot of people nowadays, that is by default negative. So unless you have somebody actively adding to your critical chance on the ship in some way, then it's likely that your opponent has actually default put that at a negative number, that you're not going to be getting any crits if they've got if you've got a lot of the negative critical chance out there, and there is more negative chance that kind of naturally exists than there is positive, particularly once you include Kira under the below deck portion. she can be a negative like 20% in your below deck if you've got her. So even if someone was slightly positive, that's going to push them to 0 or negative. But if you can get a positive critical chance, that obviously then leads to potential critical damage and hull breach. Critical damage is a set percentage that when you crit, it's going to multiply the crit by that much. And then if the opponent has hull breach, it's going to multiply that whole amount by another 1.5. There is prime research out there now that has mitigated the hull breach component by a fair bit. So it removes like 150% of that hull breach. So you're going to get the extra, but then if they've got that research, which is a prime only, then it's going to lower it. So you may see that sort of happen where your initial round crits for more and then it gets lowered by a little bit. It's likely that they have that hull breach research. But to give an idea, this is against an opponent that's about my level, and you can get a sense of what your critical damage really is because it will say on your ship one thing, but it will actually turn out to be something very different. So the best way to get a sense of what your critical damage is to look for cases where the same weapon has fired multiple times, and some of them have crit and some have not. So in this case, we've got non-critting damage of about 17.7 million, let's say. It's never the exact same number because there's a little range. So just take the average here and say 17.7 and take the average here and let's say 124 million. So basically, if we took the 124 million and divide it by 17.7, then I've got a multiplier of about 700%. So I've got hull breach on. My critical damage is probably actually 460 something, and then hull breach is bringing that up to 700. So basically the idea is if I can crit against the opponent, then that weapon is going to do 7 times as much damage to them as if I don't crit. So obviously critting is a good thing. The last thing to consider is the shot multiplier. And I feel like because fights have been so short for a long time, that if you're in your 50s or 60s, you're getting a lot of 1 and 2 round fights, that the shot multiplier doesn't often have the chance to really build up on some of the officers. And so I think people have often underestimated how powerful that is if we were getting into longer fights again. And so as this apex barrier comes up and we do start to get longer fights, in addition to the isolytic defense leading to longer fights, this shot multiplier is going to start coming into effect again. So I just wanted to look at that with the 4 main officers that it affects. The first is Carol Freeman, and part of the reason I think that she was the generic best one is because she kind of had the best out of the gate shot multiplier. So her multiplier on start of combat increases your shots by 100%, but then it doesn't go up after that. So on combat start, you're now getting double shots straight up, right away, right out the gate. But then in round 2, 3, 4, it doesn't go up any further. It's just going to stay at double the entire time. Given that we had a lot of really short fights, that didn't matter because you were hitting really, really hard out of the gate, and that later game wasn't going to make a difference. And this is her captain ability, and there is some synergy theoretically, but her synergies are only 1 or 2%, so it actually doesn't make any bit of a difference, and there's no condition on this. So it doesn't require that the ship have an effect on it or anything like that. That's her officer ability. The captain ability just works straight up. Lon here is one that is a little bit more of a slow burn, but then is potentially super, super good. So while on a battleship fighting a burning player, at the start of each round, Lon increases the number of shots by 140%. Now, this is her captain's maneuver, and I'm showing it when she does have full synergy. So she's got Strike Team Una and Shax currently on her side. They both give 65% synergy. So in order to make her work well, she does have to have synergy from at least one of the officers. Both of them would total the 140%. But the way that she works is that it is 140% per round forever. There is no cap on it. It can just continue to go up forever. However, because it requires the player ship to be burning, and her burning only works once the combat has started, she does not get the extra bonus in round 1. Her extra bonus is not going to be until the person is burning, which can only happen during round 1, and therefore her effect is going to take place in round 2. But then it will continue on forever. So she's going to keep adding 1.4 number of shots for till the end of time, basically. And I have a little example of that. I guess I thought might be fun to show. I think this top one's better. But basically, here's 5-round fight against a base. And I've got Crude, Una, Shax, and ST Lan. And thanks this innocent person for donating their base unwillingly for the extra shots. But in round 1, so Avorcha's firing pattern is 2-2-4 for its weapons. So in the first, we see 2 shots. We see 2 shots. And we should see in the next round 2-2-4. But instead, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shots. And then instead of 4 on the kinetic, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 shots. So a fair bit more. And then if we just kind of jump to round 5, let's say, or let's stay here, just go up gradually. So again, instead of, it should be 2 shots here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 2 shots has now been multiplied by 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 shots. And then on this last one, I don't even think we get to the kinetic, it just dies. But basically, it is now every single round, it is adding additional shots to that, and it will do that forever. There is no cap to how far that goes. The Weyoun crew, this one is his officer ability, so it does not actually require the synergy to work. However, it does still require that he be on an explorer with morale. His increases, and this is a tier 4 Weyoun. So these first 2, their tier does not matter for the captain maneuver because the captain maneuver does not get bigger. So the synergy matters for Lon, doesn't even matter for Freeman. On the Weyoun side, his tier is going to make a difference. So at tier 4, he's at 100%. At tier 3, it's 88%, and it would go down from there, and obviously up if I get him to tier 5. But he is going to increase the weapon shots by 100% at the start of each round for 2 rounds. So that means his 100% is going to apply twice. And so again, we can grab a little example of him doing the same thing. This guy, I forget who I innocently killed for this one. I think this fella. So you can see in this case, an Enterprise fires 6 phaser shots as its default. But in this one, it is going to fire 12, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then on the second round, instead of firing 6, it's now going to fire 18. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, 18. So basically, he is taking the 100%, taking the 6, adding 6 more, but then in the next round, it's just going to be this 18 again. So he's going to continue to just give that same amount. It's not going to increase from there, whereas Lon was continuing to increase. Ducat is similar-ish to Lon, but his goes for 5 rounds. And this works a little differently in that it's not based on rounds, but is based on you being hit. So it depends actually the type of ship and the firing pattern of the ship you're fighting for how good this is. So if you put him on an interceptor, it's going to increase your shots by 42% every time you get hit. That's 42% at tier 4. So basically, that's going to accumulate for 5 rounds. Then the oldest round will drop off and it will continue. The maximum that this can get to is 800%. That would be if you're fighting a board cube. So if you fight a board cube and you're able to get to the 5th round, you are now firing 800% more than you were in the first place. And against something else, like say a Sanctus that is firing like 5 weapons every 2 rounds, then you're going to get to somewhere between 500 and 600%. So it really adds up to a lot. And when you kind of compare them in a deeper fight, you're going to get Carol at 100%, Wei Yun at 200%, Lon at God knows what, several hundred, and Ducat at several hundred. So the way that those add up over time is going to be the longer the fight, the more it's going to favor these 2 officers. However, Lon not working in round 1 really hinders it. You got to go an entire other round to get to that point that they go on. Anyway, I feel like this is an element that people don't really understand enough, just because it doesn't work against hostiles at all. So not many people are sitting there counting their shots, and a lot of PvP has been so short, there hasn't been an opportunity to see some of this go into the late part of the game. Even in trying to prep for this, I had to ask a much higher player, like, can I hit your cube with something so that I could try and go 5 rounds? Or I saw that I was attacking bases, because it's one of the only things that would live that long. Either I'm going to die too quick, or the thing I'm attacking is going to die too quick. So you have to have something with a lot of things to shoot out to even get to this point. But again, as more people get the apex barrier, as more people get isolatic defense, we're going to start getting these longer and longer fights. And for very high-end people, we're already seeing fights that are now 10, 15, 20 rounds as they're fighting like with board cubes and grade 6 ships and things like that. So a recap, obviously, of what these 2 guys do. Data is going to give you 15,000 apex barrier versus interceptors. That's assuming that he's synergied with Mirror Picard. And he has a chance to assimilate. That's going to be one of the biggest drawbacks on him, unless it's somebody that really dumped a lot of money into it. By default, I think he starts at like 50% and then climbs up to like tier 4, he's at 80, and it's not until you get him to tier 5 that he now has a 100% chance to assimilate. But the way that Mirror Picard works, in order for his apex to trigger, he requires that assimilation from Data or from Dzoc below decks. And given that Dzoc can't really work in the first round of combat and is also capped at only 70%, then this becomes a not fully reliable thing unless you actually have a tier 5 Data, which of course is what they were trying to sell you, but it would have cost like, I don't know, $700, $800, $900, something kind of silly, particularly since we don't know what the meta is going to be going forward just yet. But basically the way that these work out against most ships, that 10,000 apex barrier is going to cut the damage pretty much exactly in half, and then a little more depending on the other research and things that they have. But if you were able to combine Data as captain, get that assimilate with Picard on the wing, now you're at 25,000 plus, and you are now mitigating more than 2/3 of the data, close to, or not data, of the damage, close to 70% of it if you're fighting against an interceptor. And I expect that the future is going to hold captains that are for attacking battleships and for attacking explorers. So you have to kind of know what you're gunning for and then crew for that particular thing. So overall, and this is long already, but I knew this was going to be, basically the premise behind all of this is that you have to kind of pick the offensive side of this equation or the defensive side of this equation. If you're on the offensive side, you have to command more damage increase than your opponent is mitigating. And if you're on the defensive side, you must either have so much mitigation or a certain amount of counter punch or counter to their strategy in order to outlive them. So basically, if somebody is producing 50% mitigation through the apex barrier, then in order to counter that, you have to be doing 2 times as much damage as if they didn't have that. And if they're getting to that 75% point, you need to be doing 4 times more damage, basically, in order to be able to overcome that. So what you're looking for in the crew matchups is what I'm doing actually pumping out so much more damage that it's going to overwhelm the defense that they're now adding to things? And then on the defensive side, do I have enough things in place that either I'm doing enough damage still to overpower them, or am I somehow mitigating, countering, or canceling out some benefit that they have on their end so that my defensive strategy ultimately wins in the long run? And an important thing here is to keep in mind that standard damage is now superior to isolytic damage for most encounters. Certainly most high-level ones. So if we take a look at some of the matchups, we've got the classic Carol, Honor Guard Worf, Lorca. A lot of people still think this is the best. Even before these guys, this wasn't the best for several months now, but it is the easiest. It's the most one-size-fits-all. It works on all ships. It's kind of hard to screw it up. Sort of thing, and you can usually just use it against anybody. But it kind of had slipped to probably about third best even before these guys came into play. Basically, what's happening here is you've got a flat crit percentage, which is Honor Guard Worf. So he gives you that, whatever your bonus is, depending on the tier of your officer, 75%, 100%, 50% maybe if you're lower, depending on what that is. That's what he's going to give you, but it doesn't increase. It's just that level. So if somebody has a anti-crit officer that reduces it, it's just going to reduce it and you don't get better. Lorca is going to give you the hull breach. That is going to increase the critical damage that you do. It also then creates the effect for the isolytic damage of Freeman to work. And then, as we saw before, Freeman also, right out of the gate, is going to double the amount of shots that you do. So if we kind of add this up, then we're saying, okay, I've got critical chance. Let's say that once I take into effect their negative, my critical chance is 50%. And I've got hull breach. Then I know 50% of the time my shots are going to hit for, let's say, 500-600% of what they normally do. That's a pretty good damage increase. And I've got isolytic damage in the form of Freeman, so that's going to help out. And she is doubling my shots right out of the gate. So I'm firing twice as much. When I crit, I'm hitting for 5 or 6 times as much, and I'm adding some isolytic damage to it. That's a pretty good damage output. It's not 100% because Lorca is... his highest trigger is 80%, so he's going to miss some of the time, and you're very subject to how much anti-crit your opponent has and how good your own Worf is. But then if we take a look on the flip side here, Mirror Picard is going to be giving that 10,000 apex. The assimilate chance is going to be a little bit of a weakness there. Unless they have a really high data, then you're going to have a chance to simply not fire it, especially not in the first round. Once it gets on, it'll probably be fine, but you may miss it in the first round unless you've got that full. The Picard is going to give you some isolytic damage, and then Honor Guard Worf here is going to let's assume that these are the same level, is going to be boosting you to about the same crit chance as your opponent. So basically, what advantage do you have here? You have the advantage of the 1.5 times hull breach, and you have the advantage of the double extra shots. However, on the flip side, this is cutting the damage that you're taking at least in half, so that pretty much negates completely the extra damage that Carol is doing in the form of extra shots. Your Honor Guard Worf cancels out their Honor Guard Worf. Let's say that they're the same. And then the fact that they are assimilated actually lowers the effect of some of the abilities. So it's not even 100% extra that you're actually getting. It's going to be potentially lower than that. So given the extra survivability, given that you've got isolytic, they've got isolytic, you've got crits, they've got crits, you're now very well canceling this out. So if you are in a superior ship, if you're in a slightly better position in the battle triangle, whatever, this crew should now completely smother this crew and be able to take them out in most one-on-one fights. It's obviously going to be subject to these two hitting their abilities on time in the first round, and it's going to depend on the officer ability of these two and the tier of these two. But basically, here's a chance where the defense almost perfectly counters out the offense from the other crew. So this is a pretty good matchup, and it's a very direct counter to what these are doing. If we take a look at another matchup here, we've got a much stronger crit crew, we've got a much stronger shot multiplier, and we've got either the choice of isolytic here, or we could run Damar to reduce their crits too, which I'll get to later. But at the same time, if you know this is what you're fighting, you have the ability to flip the Picard and the data to get the extra 15,000 apex barrier from fighting against an interceptor, since this crew must be on an interceptor in order to work. So we are taking now, basically by round 2, we're going to be at or near 100% crits. So while Worf is giving us a flat crit percentage that doesn't go up, this Garrick is going to be increasing the chance to crit every round that he exists, which is going to basically by round 2 or 3 simply hit 100%, and there's nothing you can do about it. So we're going to be critting 100% of the time, and we're going to be shooting more the longer and longer the fight goes. Every time we hit them, they're going to increase the number of shots that they get back. And of course, they get the isolytic. Here, we've got decent crit in the form of Honor Guard Worf, but we've got immaculate defense. We've got really, really good defense. We're giving up the isolytic damage that Captain Picard is going to give us, or Mirror Captain Picard is going to give us, but we're doing it for way more of the apex defense. We're going to be mitigating like 70% of what they're doing. So the real question here is, what is their crit bonus compared to our crit bonus, and how much more is Garrick going to be making them crit compared to what Worf is going to be making them crit? And then what is the shot multiplier going to be? If we think that we can end this fight in 3 or 4 rounds or so, then we're probably going to win that matchup. If, however, they have the durability to drag it to a longer fight, then this side gets better and better and better, and this side never gets any better. It's just as good as it was in round 1. So once you get to a point that they're critting 100%, they're firing more shots, they're doing isolytic and we're not, or we're only doing what the ship and our other artifacts innately do, which is probably still a lot these days, then they're going to be definitely doing much more damage to us, and we're not really having anything that can overpower them. However, because we're running Honor Guard Worf, if we're still able to crit, like let's say 30-40% of the time, that may be enough to just beat them before they get to that point that it is doing 500% more shots, max crits, things like that. So this is a reasonable counter to this, but it totally depends. If this is on a superior ship, it will almost always win. If you are on a matchup where you're a lot closer in what the matchup is, that you're, let's say you're both on Sanctuses that are about the same level, you're about the same ops level, this extra damage is probably going to overpower things. And then once you throw in the chance that this data may not trigger, these guys are all 100%. They will never fail. So that is going to make a difference there. To look into another matchup here, we've got the strike team for the battleships. Here we've got a shield bypass coming from Strike Team Una. We've got extra shots, obviously coming from Lon. Again, that is infinite, but they do not start in round 1. And we've got the isolytic coming from shacks. But here we've got nothing that is giving us crits, so just whatever your natural crit rate is, which unfortunately for most battleships, given that other people have negative research and probably Kira below deck, then it's going to be about 0% or a very low number. So it's going to be rare that this side is going to end up critting. However, what it does have in its favor is that in a longer fight, a fight that is going to go 3, 4, 5 rounds, having Una here is going to completely ignore the shield on your opponent's ship after a few rounds. So while you've got this 50% apex barrier coming up, that 80% that you usually have on shields is going to be ignored completely after about the 3rd round. However, we've again got the assimilate chance here by data. Assimilate will affect the ST Lawn ability and lower the amount that it's giving you for extra shots. We've got a good crit damage multiplier here. We've got a crit chance, and we likely have a positive crit damage. So even if we're only doing like 30% crits, that's likely going to overwhelm the damage output that they're coming out with. And again, Mirror Picard is giving isolytic, Shax is giving isolytic. Mirror Picard probably gives even a little more unless they've got Shax at tier 4 or higher. Your Captain Picard is going to do that better. So overall here, you're likely better off on the defensive side of this, simply because while they've got Una as a shield bypass, they just don't have anything really ramping up the damage, but you do. You do have something that's going to take your shots, and when you crit, multiply them by 5, 6, 7, 8%, or 800%, sorry, to overwhelm this. So it's likely that you'll basically get this side dead before they even get to the point that shield bypass even comes into play. And then there's just nothing to take it up another notch. And the fact that the extra shots don't kick in until round 2 is going to make it so just really anemic out of the gate, and it takes a while to build up. However, again, I could see the game shifting a lot towards the Borg cube being the most dominant thing, and it has so many hit points that if it starts to make use of Una, I think there is opportunity there to just get fights where it is shooting hundreds of shots and bypassing shields completely in order to win fights. And then you probably don't need the isolytic damage here. You can put in swap in something else to make this work, either the original strike team member or whatever. But I think, again, in a reasonable fight where you're evenly matched up, I think, again, the mirror side is probably going to pull this one out. Now, here's one that I think there's no doubt that the mirror side wins, and we get a variation yet again on this side of the aisle. Here we get the classic Weiyun crew with the isolytic component added onto it. Pawn is a very, very effective anti-crit officer, so there's not much point running the Honor Guard Wharf against him. By the 2nd round, Pawn will have him at absolute 0. He reduces, at max tier, going to reduce the crit chance by 78% per round, so you may sneak a couple in round 1. By round 2, he's definitely done. It's going to be a negative number. Weiyun increases the extra shots that you're going to fire, but only to a maximum of 300%, which would happen in round 2, and then he doesn't go higher from there, and then Ransom is going to give us our isolytic damage. On the flip side here, Picard works on the wing, Data works on the wing. Picard's captain ability was to give us isolytic. However, Freeman's officer ability, it was to give us isolytic damage, and her captain ability is to double the number of shots. So round 1, Weiyun doubles, Carol doubles. We've got the extra 10,000 apex barrier. We've got the assimilation, which is going to lower the ability on this side. And we've got isolytic against isolytic because the assimilate does count as a state on the ship. So basically, we've got all the things they have, plus we've got the apex barrier, and they've got an anti-crit officer that isn't stopping any crits that we weren't trying to do anyway. So again, this one I think is the matchup between the classic strike team and the new mirror that is the most dominant. It's the one that you just completely body them, which is really interesting because I think up until now, this was actually the best PvP crew because it could use Pawn to shut down the Ducat crew. It could use Pawn to shut down the Honor Guard Wharf on the Freeman crew. And then because it gave extra shots over a longer fight compared to Freeman, it actually won out if two even ships fought each other. And it really prevented a lot of punch-ups. So if you were in a strong explorer and anyone was even slightly lower than you, it just kind of mutes what they have and you could dominate them with just the stronger ship. Or if they were trying to use a bad crew, you could punch up a bit. But basically it was like the field leveler, that it would just say the strongest ship wins, our crews don't really matter. But in this case, you can run such a strong counter to it by simply ignoring its main ability, by not attempting to go for crits, and then kind of canceling out a lot of what it does and just kind of overwhelming it by having more defense. It's an even bigger field leveler than that crew was originally intended to be. So if we look at another couple variations, or a few variations to go with the mirror crew, you can run mirror flocks. So if somebody is trying to run something crit based on the other side, Honor Guard Wharf, maybe you don't like your Honor Guard Wharf, or you feel that you don't have as good crit damage research as they may have, if you know that they've got higher, you can run this in order to weaken their ability to crit, and now you've just taken that off the table and you're running your apex barrier against their inability to crit. Another thing to do here, and this would only work on battleships, is ST Una is one of the interesting strike team in that she does not require the state to activate. So most of the other ones are kind of like requires hull breach or requires morale. Una does not actually require the other ship to be burning. She just has to be on a battleship. It doesn't matter if the other ship is burning. So you can use Picard here data and do Una, and then that will bypass their shields after a few rounds. So the whole premise of what you're trying to do is to survive long enough to get into a deeper fight. Then every weapon you do, instead of increasing its actual damage, you simply take their shield mitigation off the table and you run her as a sidecar to the mirror team, and then you're bypassing their shields and doing more direct hull damage. This is going to be an interesting one too, in particular if you're trying to punch up or do damage to somebody that you know you can't actually beat. So if you're in something like a territory defense, or again trying to defend a base in an incursion or something, and there's a ship there that you really kind of can't beat, then this is one option to go after them, to basically force the fight to go more rounds by you being so defensive, but also just bypassing their shield at the same time. You could stick in a Harrison here if somebody was way over your head and you knew you'd only get one round against them anyway, but against a somewhat, there's several levels above you, you can't win, but you want to do enough damage to them that after 3 or 4 hits they'll die, then this is kind of a good crew for that sort of thing. And I think, again, if you're also just a stable ship, then it is one that could potentially just take out opponents pretty cheaply without much offense, but just bypassing everything. Trip Tucker is another interesting one. He has to be probably a high enough tier for this to matter, but he again kind of runs as a type of anti-crit. If you've got him high enough, it lowers the crit damage that your opponent is doing, and if they don't have the crit prime, which I think a lot of people don't have the crit floor, and they've only got the amount in the X-Borg store, the 100%, then it's just going to lower them to that floor, and their crits are going to be the same as any other hit. So it's just another officer that you could put in that if he's high enough, it's going to take their crits completely off the table, and then you're just going to be in behind your nice apex barrier, and they're out here swinging for the fences and hitting nothing. Another option here, if you're against it, kind of where you're the superior opponent in a way, or the type of ship that you're fighting is going to be doing Mirror Mirror Marcus or Mirror Mirror Charvanek or Mirror Mirror Kang, the old triumvirate guys, the Trinity guys that are going to be against certain ship types. So you're going to run Marcus against like Explorers, for instance, and this is going to increase the mitigation you have against their standard damage. So if you know that your isolytic damage is really good, but you're only at like a 50% to 40% standard mitigation against this opponent, then running these officers is going to increase what that mitigation is, which kind of takes their top line number a bit off the table, and you're again going to be in a better situation here. The last one is more for when you're probably there's a weird curve here. If you're in very, very high ships, like high 60s and huge cubes and like 70 ships and so on, that fire actually less shots and are just way more durable in hull, you're potentially in a lot longer fights. And I think if you're actually on the much lower end, where you're in the 30s or low 40s, some of your fights may also go for 10 plus rounds. In some of these cases, if you're not on an interceptor, then using Khan, who's going to increase the likelihood to crit for each shot, is going to potentially in the long run be better than Honor Guard Worf. Honor Guard Worf actually wears off after 8 rounds, which doesn't usually matter. Phlox is the same way. He wears off after 8 rounds. Most fights that we've been in for the past like 2 years have not really gone past that point anyway, but Khan is now opening the door for those longer fights. So he's going to take a lot longer to ramp up, but he's never going to stop. So whatever their innate crit negative is, Khan is eventually going to overpower that, and if you're in a long enough fight, then theoretically he should be fine. He's going to hit a point that he's eventually doing 100% crits all the time, and there's nothing that anyone can do about it. So if you know that you're in a particular situation, that you're going to be in a fight that's like 12 plus rounds long, then Khan may actually be better than Honor Guard Worf, but you're trading early part of the fight for the later part of the fight. So you've got to be sure what that's going to be in order for that to be the best option. Then variations on the strike teams here. The first one is actually going to weirdly put things back to the way they used to be, which is that Damar also lowers the crit damage of their opponent. So since isolytic damage isn't as important anymore, and Damar also gives the same synergy as Andy Billups to Ducat, because this was the original crew, this can actually be better once again in a longer fight. So every time basically every hit, again, he's going to lower the critical damage that your opponent is doing. So if you got him at a tier 4 or 5, he's going to potentially, again, lower them to whatever the crit floor is over a longer period of time. So if you're critting because of your Garrick and you're able to lower their crit damage, then you eventually get to a point that even if you're both critting all the time, they're doing way less when they hit theirs and you're doing way more when you hit yours. So this can actually end up being better than Billups because of that isolytic defense being so high and hitting so weakly. And again, it's the natural matchup. It's just back to the norm. On this one, the Weiyun pawn one, we're now potentially taking a chance. So the weakness here has always been that these guys are purely defensive and then they don't have anything kind of offensive to throw in. So we trade off the second synergy. So there's now a chance that Weiyun does not hit his morale in the first round. He's only got a 60% chance to hit it. However, we are trading off our own crits for it. So we're getting Honor Guard Worf on our side, who's going to now give us the ability to do some actual offense on an Explorer, which usually doesn't exist, but we're still using our pawn when the morale does trigger to lower theirs. So if they're reliant on an Honor Guard Worf on their side, and we've got one on our side, but we can, one hit of pawn will take theirs to 0 or below or close to 0, then the trade-off here is that we're going to out-punch them and do more damage with ours, and even though we're taking a chance that our Weiyun is not going to work. So there's, again, it's a potential kind of punch-up crew, or when you're fighting against something that you know would otherwise smother you, like the Mirror Honor Guard Worf would likely be a thing that takes you out, or that Carol Mirror, then this is a good way to punch back against that and actually put some offense on the table and not let them be strictly defensive against you. This one doesn't actually rely on synergy. So the Strike Team Lon, Strike Team Una, you're going to get the extra shots on synergy, but again, you don't even need the burning in the first place. So Lon creates burning, but neither of these officers actually requires burning to work in the first place. So it's just kind of a nice to have. Phlox is going to suppress the crits coming from their end, hopefully an Honor Guard Worf, and then Una is going to bypass their shield. So again, you're going to mute their offense, and then we're going to go by the sneaky, get under your shield and do more damage that way. And then Lon here at half capacity is still going to be increasing shots by 75% per round, just not the 140 if we had both synergies in play. So she's got 10% natural, 65 for each one they add to her. This variation combines kind of the best of the worlds, but at a chance yet again. So here we've got Mirror Picard, whose captain's ability is going to give us some isolytic damage. Important to note too, by the way, his isolytic damage is not strictly flat. It's 50% per round for 2 rounds. So it actually increases in the second round and then stays at that level. But basically we run Picard here as a captain. We have to then run Dzok below deck, who has a chance to trigger Assimilate as well. And odds are, if you're using a mirror crew, you want Dzok there as a backup for if your mirror data doesn't fire anyway. But the downfall of Dzok is that he really can't trigger in the first round because he requires your opponent to have a certain amount of hull damage done to them in order for him to activate. So we're going to rely on him, and we're probably going to get hammered in the first round. However, Phlox is there controlling the crit damage that we're taking, or the crit chance we're taking, and then Una is going to bypass their shields yet again so that we hopefully survive into those later rounds, get to the point that she is allowing our extra damage to get below their shield, and Picard is giving us the defense for this. So it's kind of a somewhat risky way. If you know that you can safely get to round 2, 3, 4, then this is a potential way to really just sap away their offense and sap away some of their defense as well to get underneath them. And the last crew here is really only for Rialtas. This is just kind of a fun crew that I thought I'd talk about because I like using it, particularly in incursions, to kill people in ways that they wouldn't expect. But TOS Kirk is the ultimate crappy ship captain. He works really well on something like a Rialta or the original Jellyfish, because the way he works is he amplifies the damage of the ship irrespective of what that ship is or its weapons, simply based on the stats of your officers, the attack that they have. And Uhura gives us synergy and saps some of the shield mitigation from the opponent ship, and then Honor Guard Worf is going to give us the chance to crit against your opponent. So you can basically get a Rialta out and start hitting people for 5 to 10 million worth of damage with a Rialta, and it increases every round that you stay alive because Kirk refreshes that. So this is just kind of a fun one. Go out there and poke someone with this and they won't expect it, but it is a lot of fun to use. So overall here, this meta is going to be really, really temporary, and I'm really eager to see some of the other ideas that other servers have come up with. Some of these, I've tested at least all of these to some extent. However, it's really hard to find someone kind of like your exact research level and kind of know what the matchup's going to be, sort of thing. And I think a lot of these are going to be really dynamic, where during the fights this time, you're going to have a lot of need to change your crew depending on who's there. There's not going to be a good one-size-fits-all crew. I think the closest thing to that is probably going to be this one, which is just kind of mirror Worf, mirror on the Worf, I guess. Pretty generic, but there's going to be ways to shut this down so that if you're not looking for that sort of counterpunch, then this is potentially going to be vulnerable. You're going to be swapping these two out depending on the type of ship that you're fighting to the data as captain part if you're fighting an interceptor, because I think one of the biggest vulnerabilities this has is running into this crew. But if you then swap these out, then suddenly you're a lot stronger against this and you're going to stand a better chance. Whereas if you're using it this way, that's not quite enough defense to counter the offense that this is going to do, again assuming that you and your opponent are even close in level. And I think there's going to be some fairly clever variations that people come up with to deal with individual situations and so on. So wanted to put that out there. Bit long, a bit speculative. It's all going to change basically once we get 2 more officers. The big theme to this whole thing is that I feel these 2 guys are just missing something. So they're missing major components, either extra shots, crits, anti-crits, something. Those 3 things have dominated the PvP scene for a long time. The Apex barrier is adding a lot to it, and you can stick on a crit person as a wingman, but it just feels like it's still not quite the complete package, and I don't think it's intended to be. I think the intent is that there's going to be more officers in the next month or 2 that are going to round this out, so now you've got all 3 working in synergy. We'll see if that's the way that it does play out, but I think this is going to be a really interesting incursion just because you're going to have a lot of people trying to run this, and a lot of these people are going to run into a brick wall, and then a lot of people are going to adapt to it and kind of counter that brick wall and come up with clever things to use against it. And I also think over the next few months, we're going to get situations where the research is going to build up. There's going to be artifacts. There's going to be other things. There's going to be ways to cancel out Apex barrier, things like that that are going to come into play. And I think we're going to get a really shifting meta for the next little while. But this is definitely going to lead to the most dynamic it's been in a long time. When the original strike teams came out, it was just, these are the 3 answers, use them on that ship, and that's how it is. When the isolytic guys came out, it varied it a tiny bit, but not that much. It changed it more into I want to say rock, paper, scissors, but it kind of became rock, slightly smaller rock, and wet piece of paper towel, in that there was kind of 2 or 3 answers that were right, but there wasn't really a good way for the battleship to compete anymore. And if you didn't have these things, there was kind of no way to counter it. But then Phlox came along, made that a little better, and so on. But I think in this case, you're going to see probably some of the most variety ships that you've got. There's some other guys here that can fill in. I mentioned Harrison for that 1-round punch completely through the shields sort of play. There's probably a few that I'm not even thinking of here that could provide a really niche or a really important thing into things, and I think that could be cool. So we'll see. And I think another thing that's going to hinder a lot of people trying to use these crews is their data. I don't think it was available free at all, so you pretty much had to buy them to get them. Probably a lot of people that are PvP focused did at least unlocked him, but I doubt many people maxed him. That's a lot of money to max him. It's one thing to buy a half pack and get him. It's another to put $900 in and max the guy. So I don't think many people are going to be coming out there maxed. It's only going to be kind of the very, very high level whales. And then even they are not going to have a maxed Picard at this point. They're probably going to have a tier 2 Picard, if that. Mine's at tier 1. So yeah, basically I think that's going to be a really big X factor, and then we're going to have to see how the sourcing for that goes, because I think data may only become truly reliable once you get them to that tier 4, tier 5, and a lot of people are going to take a long time to get them to that point, if it's even possible at all. So yeah, curious what people think. If anyone has any other ideas, officer combos they've been using, down below. Also, it's always good to hear from people of different levels. I know that people 5, 6 levels above me at 67, 8, 9, 70, the experience is a bit different. Whereas I feel like from the 50s to the low 60s, pretty similar. But then again, in the low 40s, you get these longer fights. So if you're getting different experiences, I'd love to hear what's working for you, what sort of things you're coming up against. And of course, I acknowledge that most people, probably most players, literally don't have all these officers, or even I'm sure there's tons of people out here that do not have a single full crew of what I'm showing, because a lot of these things were fairly paid when they came out. I hope that a lot of people have taken advantage of the Section 31 stuff to at least get the strike teams together, because you can do that as a free-to-play now. But obviously these new guys now no longer in that category, so you may be missing them, but there are definitely opportunities. Oh, this is a bad example, but opportunities for you to punch back against them, whether you've got the chance to get those crews or not. So love to hear what works for you now and after the incursions. Take care.